thermal plant, etc., needs this 50 hertz very precisely, to the extent that if it deviates too much, the plant will disconnect from the grid. It will trip offline to protect the equipment. This can create a cascading failure, right? Because then you have even less generation, which degrades the frequency even more, which causes further and further generation tripping off until you have a blackout. Now, the grid is supposed to be able to manage this, right? Because you will always have small disturbances. One very important contribution to this is this grid inertia, right? Which we're hearing about a lot now. It's one of these rare times in which a very technical term enters the conversation, kind of like spike proteins or something back in the day.
Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Guillem Sanchis Ramirez, a Spanish nuclear engineer and environmentalist and co-founder of Econucleares, a grassroots organization dedicated to defending nuclear energy in Spain. And Spain's nuclear fleet is in need of defense, as Spain actually, I think, had one of the first nuclear moratoriums in the world, and is on track for a phase-out by 2035. But that is not what we are here to talk about, primarily at least. There was a pretty major grid event that happened earlier this week, the Great Iberian Blackout. I'm not sure if it's earned its own moniker or descriptor just yet. But Guillem, welcome to Decouple, first of all, and then let's talk about this blackout.
Hi there, Chris. Thanks for having me. Those are beautifully rolled R's, by the way, let me tell you.
Thank you, sir. I did live in the south of Spain for about 7 months. I got the R's, but I have lost my lisp. You have to forgive me for that. So my friend, what happened? What happened earlier this week? What was it like to live through that?
So yes, there was a big blackout on Monday, April the 28th. The Spanish and Portuguese grid went down, leaving over 50 million people without power for more than 6 hours, some closer to 24 hours. Luckily, it was in the middle of the day in May, so not too hot, not too cold, so minimizing the immediate danger of no power. But of course, definitely a big event. The Great Blackout, it's being already called in the media. We'll see if that sticks. Definitely the biggest in Spain's history, yes.
Mm-hmm. And you're saying that probably rivals what we experienced here in North America, I believe it's 2007, 2008. Just to get a sense of the scale of this, you said 50 million people sort of plunged, not into darkness because it's the middle of the day, but where were you when it started, and what were the experiences? Again, good time of year for this to happen, good time of day for this to happen, but what were the sort of what was the human experience of this event?
Right. So for me personally, like most people, I was at work. Power went out. After assuming for a minute that it was a local issue, we realized some of us had still phone signal for a few minutes, that they definitely was not a local issue. So we just, those of us with cars went home. The main consequence was quite a traffic jam, because of course everyone else was doing the same. But a lot of people in Spain use trains as main form of commuting. So there were people stuck away from home for hours, some until the next morning. And there were thousands of people stuck in elevators, trains, metros, underground, in tunnels. So it was definitely disruptive. We did have a few victims that we know of. I know of a couple, for instance, with carbon monoxide poisoning from handling diesel generators.
Tell me about that, just kind of situational awareness. You said you had signal for a kind of brief moment. In terms of understanding what was going on in the scope and scale of it, how long did that take? And then how did you get your information once all the cell phone networks were down?
Right. So the communications were a big part of it. The cell towers went down in a few minutes, and they remained spotty through the whole day. I assume they have batteries. Definitely, this will be looked at from now on. It sounds quite insane that they don't have 10 or 12 hours of battery power, because nowadays losing the communication just basically puts you in the dark, but also how we run our systems in the grid itself, right? So we found out we followed the news mostly by radio. So radios in the cars and battery powered radios that people had from back in the day. In fact, it was in the news. I don't know if you saw from a few weeks earlier that the European Commission put out a recommendation for a kind of survival pack, right? Given how war was in the news and stuff like that. So they were recommending, a few days worth of water, non-perishable food, etc. And among these things were also battery-powered lights and radios. So a lot of people had gotten them for that case, and that turned out quite useful.
I'm going to be having Alexander Stahil on the podcast, I believe, next week or the week after. He's done some great writing about the European grid on his Twitter. He's talked about electricity as being kind of like oxygen within a civilization, within a society, and just how everything kind of grinds to a complete halt. And I guess you lived that experience. We don't need to go into that in a ton more detail, but again, there's just fascinating images of people, getting out of subway trains and walking down dark subway tunnels. Those are maybe some of the more dramatic examples, but anything else that kind of comes to your mind just on a human scale from having lived through it, what it sort of makes you feel or think about going into the future. I guess just that kind of existential sense of instability. We live in such a moment of complex technology where you feel like you have such immediate access to information, to AI databases, and all of a sudden that's kind of snuffed out. I'm again just curious about the feeling of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's of course it's a cliche, but we do depend on technology and communications and electricity to an extent that we don't usually realize. Maybe those of us dealing with the energy, with the power grid, it's more top of mind. But for most people, it definitely was a reminder, because of course we know it in a way, of how much we depend on electricity, how radically our lives change, even if just for a few hours, without access to electricity, and of course with access to communication networks. We did see, the human side of it. I think you saw online people spontaneously directing traffic with the traffic lights down, neighbors getting together to follow the news on the radio. So we did see that side of it, the nicer faced side of it. But definitely it highlights what we already know, which is the big dependence, how much our lives are organized around having 24/7 access to, among other things, electricity.
Right. Power came back on very quickly. Like for an outsider who it's a bit of a curiosity, it seems like a bit of a blip, but it seems like this maybe has left a pretty big mark on Spanish society.
Right. Yeah, definitely for a blackout of this size, the 6 to 12 to in some cases 24 hours it took to get things back to normal definitely would have not been surprising that it would have taken much longer. The interconnection with France, as limited as it is, and to a lesser extent with Morocco, definitely helps speed things up. Between that and hydropower, which can self-start, as we will get into in a minute, that helped.
And so, walk us through what I understood. I understand this is a little bit like, when we have an aircraft accident, it's going to take quite a while to do the forensics and figure out the precise details of what went wrong. But what's our best guess right now? And then let's kind of move into a broader discussion about the intricacies of the Spanish grid and how it's been changing over time.
That's right. So yes, of course, disclaimer, this is a developing story. But and as you say, the details, the millisecond to millisecond exact cause and mechanism, we'll know in weeks and months. What we do now know right now, and is what the grid manager put out, is that, and I have my notes here so I quote it properly, is that at 12:33 p.m. midday, the grid suffered what they call an event akin to a loss of generation in the southwest region. They say it's likely, but not assured, that it started in a solar facility, also that fits with the profile of generation in that region. After that, the grid did self-stabilize in a few milliseconds, but that after 1.5 seconds, a second event, what they also called akin to a loss of generation, happened, that it's likely related to the first one, and that this one did not stabilize, and 3.5 seconds, it had propagated and got severe enough that it caused an interruption with the interconnection with France. The interconnection with France is 2.5 gigawatts at max capacity. It's relatively small for the size of the grid. It's much smaller to what the European Union marks as targets that countries should be interconnected as. It's a fraction of that, and that may have contributed to the extent of the issue. That immediately after that, a massive loss of renewable generation happened, probably because of the disruption this loss of the interconnection caused by itself, and that was followed by a cascading loss of more and more generation, nuclear, gas-fired, and hydro disconnected from the grid, until there was a complete collapse of generation, which it did reach zero. We did reach a complete as a blackout, although initial reports contradicted that. This is what we know. This is what the grid has put out in sort of a preliminary statement. Mechanisms that were speculated at the beginning and in the immediate hours have by now been discarded, ruled out by the grid operator, which is either a cyber attack, which was also, of course, one of the first hypotheses or rumors. Also, there was mentions of some sort of anomalous atmospheric event. They also ruled that out for the moment. There was also the hypothesis that the disconnection of the interconnector with France caused the event, although they now believe that was a consequence and not the initiating event. So these are the facts as we know them at the moment.
So this is somewhat ironic in that it's occurring after a rather breathless set of headlines from April 16th and the 21st, I believe, that Spain had managed to run entirely on renewables during a weekday. I think that was a record-setting event. And then what happened on the 21st of April? There was another headline there.
That's exactly right. So yeah, quite ironically, I'm sure they were hoping to not have given that as much publicity as they did. Also, a few days before, the grid actually went out of their way to dispel the rumors that the grid was at that point prone to having blackouts. Also, somewhat ironically, there's this annual report that they put out. The consulting firm called Ernst & Young puts out, in which they said that, and I'm also, to say it properly, I'm quoting it, the continued shutdown of conventional generation stations, such as coal, combined cycle, natural gas, and nuclear, implies a reduction of firm power and grid balancing capabilities, as well as its robustness and inertia. That prompted a series also of headlines and conversation in social media that the grid was indeed more fragile, more prone to blackouts in the right circumstances. They did go out of their way to point out that was not the case. Well, turns out it was.
So I guess we're still trying to digest exactly what happened, and we're gonna get that analysis over the next days, weeks, months, who knows. But large power generators ceased producing power, if I'm correcting that, if I'm getting that correctly. It was midday. It was a sunny day. There's a lot of solar on the grid. Is there any speculation as to why or how much power tripped offline to start causing these cascades, or that information's not available yet?
Across these two incidents that were the initiators, as the grid said, this fits with the press appearance of the Prime Minister, which mentioned, and that was later confirmed, that 15 gigawatts were lost on generation in the grid in a matter of 5 seconds. A gigawatt, as you know, quite conveniently in the nuclear space, is also about the size of a large reactor, and as a rule of thumb, is the power that a million households consume. So 15 of those, or that's 60% of the generation at the time, basically vanished from the grid in a matter of 5 seconds. So this is the dimension.
This seems like a big pregnant question. Like, how the hell does that happen?
Precisely, yes. That's what we're all asking ourselves. And as you said, the precise cause and mechanism may take days or weeks or months to know. The grid is, of course, investigating it. The government has launched their own investigation, as well as the European Commission, which is expected within 6 months. So we will get, I'm sure, in the future, exactly the details of that.
But again, I mean, there's this initial inciting event, which is essentially that power producing technologies stop producing power. You could understand that, with more conventional forms of generation, that could happen through a number of different mechanisms. And then there's this sort of cascading failure. Can you walk us through that? And we don't have to go into any high level in terms of how the grid operates and protects itself, but the importance of maintaining frequency in terms of 50 hertz in the EU. What happens as the grid sort of responds to a drop or an increase in grid frequency? Why is it important, and how do things cascade?
Just as a 20-second refresher, the grid operates rather on an alternating current, as you said, 50 hertz, so 50 cycles per second of this oscillation of the electricity in the wires, so to speak, right? And this is a very fine balancing act between generation and consumption, right? So at all times, the grid must be providing as much power as is consumed. There's some, but not very meaningful amount of bulk power generation. And so as a general rule, electricity is generated as it is consumed, right? And this 50 hertz oscillation, right? You can think about it like a musical note. This must be maintained very precisely. It's measured up to, with 3 decimals, 50.000, right? If at any given point there is too much generation, the frequency will creep up. And if at any given point there's too much load, too much consumption for the generation that there is, the frequency will creep down, right? And the issue that can trigger events like this is that equipment in general is designed to operate very precisely within this frequency, 50 hertz in our case, both on the load side, household appliances, everything, but more pertinently on the generation side, all the turbines in thermal plants, etc., needs this 50 hertz very precisely, to the extent that if it deviates too much, and we're talking decimals of a hertz for more than a few seconds, the plant will disconnect from the grid. It will trip offline to protect the equipment. So obviously, if the frequency drifts down too much to start enough to start tripping equipment off the grid, it's obvious that this can create a cascading failure, right? Because then you have even less generation, which degrades the frequency even more, which causes further and further generation tripping off of the grid until you have a blackout. Now, the grid is supposed to be able to manage this, right? Because you will always have small disturbances. Plants can trip offline for some unrelated reason. A large amount of load can come onto the grid or also trip off the grid. And so one very important contribution to this is this grid inertia, right? Which we're hearing about a lot now. It's one of these rare times in which a very technical term enters the conversation, kind of like spike proteins or something back in the day. So when we talk about grid inertia, we're talking about the very massive steam turbines of thermal plants. So nuclear, natural gas, coal, in the case of Spain, very residual. And we're literally talking about the mass, the physical inertia, right? The very massive turbines rotating at 50 times per second, which by the sheer amount of rotational energy have the capacity to absorb these disturbances by very how do I say? By very imperceptibly slow down or speed up as needed. And we've seen cases in the past where this sheer amount of rotational energy has been enough to sustain the grid in for a minute or two in very severe situations in which just by again slowing down a fraction of a hertz of frequency, I've been able to save a very large grid from blackouts. What is the problem that is potentially, again, and this is a developing story here, that as grids such as the Spanish one incorporate more and more renewable generation, we're incorporating what's called asynchronous generation, which just means it does not have this inertia, right? We don't have these massive turbines rotating obviously in a solar panel, which just produces direct current, which is converted to alternating current with power electronics, and also in newer wind turbines. The older ones did directly rotate at the speed of the grid. The newer ones, yes, the smaller ones did adapt themselves to the frequency of the grid, so they were what's called grid forming. They imposed just like a steam turbine this frequency on the grid. The newer ones are allowed to operate more efficiently by rotating at higher speeds, and then the signal is, again with power electronics, converted to grid frequency. But what that means, as I said, this is called grid following as opposed to grid forming, because they need a reference signal, a reference, sinusoidal oscillating signal to adapt themselves to. And so they are much more sensitive to perturbations in this frequency, such that it's if too many of those are in the grid, like it could have been the case, it can have been the case perhaps on Monday, very small amounts of perturbation, instead of being dampened out by all this, again, inertia, can propagate to catastrophic proportions.
And as we were saying just a few days before this event, or a week before the event, the power production profile in Iberia was essentially 100% these grid following resources.
That's right. So the regulator does, or the grid operator does impose a minimum amount of rotational energy, because of course they're very aware of this. But we've seen, and we started seeing it more and more starting last year, where in shoulder seasons of low demand, such as spring, so not to need for heating, not yet need for air conditioning, perhaps weekends or Easter holidays. We saw actually for the first time last year, last March 2024, nuclear plants going, not only operating what's called in flexible operation, right? That's load following, it's called. Yeah. Not only load following, but actually going offline for prolonged periods, days, and even in a couple of cases, a week or two, just because, just by virtue of the renewable power being cheaper, essentially free, right? They were entering the power auction, which is the system in Spain, at essentially €0 per megawatt hour, and they were able to push out these nuclear plants, which, of course, they would rather not operate than operate at zero cost, or rather at zero, revenue for themselves. And so there was warnings starting last year, continuing this year, as you said, that this was a risky situation, right? Because you do let those renewable resources into the grid at zero, essentially euros per megawatt hour. But what that leaves you is with much less a rolling reserve, right? Inertia again in the grid. I think we were talking about at that moment only 20 at the moment of the blackouts, only 25% conventional generation. So we're talking hydro in this case, gas and nuclear, so rotating turbines, instead of the 35 or 40 that we saw both a few weeks ago this year and at this time last year. And so this is where the conversation is going a lot at the moment. That this could have been a potential mechanism.
So there's probably some kind of ideal ratio in terms of the amount of grid following you can deploy and how much grid forming you need. And I guess we're learning those lessons, and sometimes they're a little bit painful. But suffice it to say, you're saying that we've been playing with those margins a little bit, partially encouraged by liberalized electricity markets, which do not have mechanisms to really reward grid firming resources.
Potentially, yes, definitely. More people, more expert in grids than us, have been ringing that bell increasingly in the last couple of years, and even more increasingly this year in the months leading up to this. So definitely, they will be looking at that.
Let's just get a basic context and some numbers out of the way in terms of understanding like the composition of the Spanish grid and how that's changed over the last decade or so. Just in broad terms, just so people have a frame of reference here. Spain does have nuclear. It didn't quite go the Mesmer route like France did. But just walk us through a little bit of the history of again, the resources that have been on the grid.
Right. So we did start that route. In fact, in the 60s, we have a Twitter thread in which we from back in the day, in which we explain a bit the history of the Spanish nuclear plant, rather in the nuclear sector. And back in the 60s, early 70s, we were amongst the European nations with the highest proportion of nuclear in our grid. We were amongst the first European countries to get nuclear power at all. But yes, by the late 70s, early 80s, there was definitely a different atmosphere. The green winds of change had gotten into Spain. We had also some political issues around terror attacks in the Basque Country linked to the construction of nuclear plants, and as you mentioned, the moratorium was put in place in the 80s. At that point, we had plans for up to 24 reactors. In the years preceding that, we now have 5 plants with 7 reactors, which provide 20% of our yearly energy.
And that historically, I guess it was more sort of coal, and now you're into obviously a lot of renewables. I was surprised actually how much wind there is. Probably as much wind as solar and gas. That's the direction things have moved, I guess.
Right. So yeah, the big, the last 20-25 years have seen the explosion of these variable renewables. Sun, obviously Spain, right? Famously sunny, lots of empty space, quote unquote. Similar with wind, we have a lot of plains with not much population density, and so we did invest quite strongly on that. We had historically an important proportion of coal, which is now essentially zero. And yes, as I said, so nuclear being 20%, a large amount of hydro also historically. We have a good geography for it, and luckily in the as we're seeing, of course, water management also a big thing in Spain. So historically, that has also been a big priority.
And I imagine the reason that there was an interest in nuclear in the 60s and 70s was partially rooted in energy security concerns. Spain not having large coal reserves or endogenous gas or oil.
That's right.
Correct in that assumption?
So yeah, as it was the fashion at the time, both for energy security and perhaps an eye on potential weapon development, although that idea, to my knowledge, was abandoned pretty quickly, yes. We do have also uranium in Spain. We mined it for decades, although it is illegal at the moment. And so that did open a route to energy sovereignty. We have uranium, we have fuel fabrication facilities, and so a large amount of the fuel cycle could be carried out domestically, and still is.
Okay, so we have a little bit of a nuclear renaissance that was heading in a mesmer direction, and then got snuffed out. It sounds partially that was, you mentioned sort of the green winds of change started blowing, but also, I mean, you had a dictatorship that fell. The old man Franco passed away, I think, in 1975. So there's sort of a beyond the environmental politics of it. It seems maybe similar to South Korea and Taiwan, where the nuclear industry was really associated with a pretty brutal form of politics. It sounds like there was a bit of a backlash and blowback against nuclear, just maybe as a kind of cultural political reaction beyond just the environmental narrative.
Right, to a lesser extent than in these places. I did mention the case of the Lemoniz nuclear power plant in the Basque Country, but that's more specifically, the politics of the area. There was the terrorist band ETA at the time, opposing it, kidnapping and murdering two of the head engineers. That led to the construction being paused and then abandoned, I think at 90+% completion, and all the equipment being sold to France. We had another plant in Extremadura that also was partially constructed at the time, but abandoned.
Yeah, the Lemoniz story is crazy because Decouple videographer Jesse Freeston, he was out at Super Phoenix and did a little bit of a story about the I believe he's a Swiss, now a Green Party deputy or member in Switzerland who shot an RPG at the Super Phoenix. But ETA, the Basque separatist group, actually got bombs into the reactor building, the turbine hall, all during construction. But then, as you mentioned, kidnapped the chief engineer and held him hostage and said, "We'll release him if you demolish the plant." it was dramatic.
Quite a very particular case, of course, but that probably did contribute to the changing attitudes towards nuclear at the time. Yes.
Right. Okay. I don't want to get too sucked in just yet to nuclear, and we're going to get into the moratorium. I want to kind of still keep some focus on the blackout and the political response to it. But we have brought up the nuclear question. I was looking at a video from Pedro Sanchez, who I believe is the current Prime Minister of Spain, and he was responding to this question of, is the nuclear phaseout a good idea, I guess? Well, I wasn't there to see the question, but I'm imagining they're feeling some heat from the political opposition saying, hey, maybe closing the nuclear plants in the context of this episode where concepts like grid inertia are entering into the public parlance. Maybe that's not such a good idea. Tell us about that press conference, the questions and the answers that were given.
Right. It's even better than that, Chris. There was no question at all. That was with no prompting. He went out of his way to, less than 24 hours into the blackout to say that A, we don't know what caused it, but B, we know it's not the excess of renewables. Not sure how those two things can be true at the same time. And C, that nuclear, far from his words were far from contributing. They were, a net. They were a problem. That's what he said, right? Pointing out how the plants did go offline. They did trip offline when they lost external power, which of course that's what they're designed to do, and how also they were diverting power from the grid during the process of restart, as is also the protocol. The plants can run more or less indefinitely with their own internal diesel generation, but it is protocol to treat them as priority load once you start restarting the grid. Of course, obviating the main point, which is that perhaps if those nuclear plants had been running, last Monday would just have been a regular Monday.
And so tell me about that, because I understand there were only, I think, 2 of the 7 reactors operating at the time of the blackout.
So we had 2 of them at full power, 2 more at around 70% in flexible operation, so load following. So that made for a 3.5 out of the 7.4 gigawatts. So about half. We had one plant, 3 that happened to be refueling, of course, using the shoulder season, and 2 more, Cofrentes and Almaraz Unit 1, that were, as we mentioned before, specifically not operating due to the low prices, the low power prices. So pushed out of the auctions and stopped a few days ago. So we had about half the nuclear park, a small amount of gas, and being the middle of the day, a huge amount of solar, which is as the hypothesis that we're handling. And again, we'll know exactly the details probably weeks in the future. But this is a situation that makes the grid more fragile. Also, the total consumption is lower, right? So you have a more fragile grid overall, a smaller load, and more disproportionately non-synchronous. We're talking 75%.
So it is curious that the Prime Minister, again, unprovoked, would sort of, I won't call it a diatribe, I don't want to dramatize it, but that he would venture this way. It sounds like things are pretty political. Energy is getting pretty political in Europe in general. In Spain in particular, or I'm kind of impressed that it's being discussed at a not necessarily high level, but that this is such a part of the discourse.
Right. No, I also wouldn't say quite a diatribe. He was very collected about it, but yes, it illustrates how he felt he had to defend and of course now we're getting into politics, defend his program of phasing out the nuclear reactors, right, which is a key plank on his policy and his party's policy, and has been for years. Of course, Spain being more or less the forefront of the fight for nuclear reactors. As you know, the phase out, the current plans stipulate that the phase out will start in 2027 with the first unit of Almaraz 1, not renovating its license and therefore permanently shutting down. And so that means, how the timings of these things work, that right now, middle to end of 2025 is kind of the point of no return. If Almaraz 1 is to be saved, is to not be shut down, the decision needs to be reversed now, because there's just hard deadlines around licensing, fuel ordering, and so on that you need to follow.
And as of now, there was much made of a vote, I believe a non-binding vote in the parliament, urging the government, I believe, to reverse course on this phase out, but it's official policy that this phase out is underway, or certainly being planned.
That's right. So that's again one more illustration, right, of how it's in the public conversation, right? Congress did indeed pass this resolution urging the government to reconsider at least the phase out. The plant owners have lately, which they hadn't done until the moment, actually made public statements in that direction as well. And so in a way it makes sense, right, that something that is such a key part of their policy, for whatever reasons they deem adequate, is now very much in the conversation. And of course, an event like this, nothing like an event like this to put the way we make our power back in the conversation.
I mean, we have the example of Germany's phase out now complete. Belgium has changed course. This vote you mentioned that got a majority of the votes. I'm not sure if does the opposition hold the majority of the seats, or did some members of government actually vote against the official nuclear phase out policy?
It's a minority government, so the socialists do not hold the absolute majority, and so they, in this case, some of the parties that they rely on to pass budgets and so on did vote in favor of this resolution. Notably, the Catalan nationalist parties. Of course, Catalonia being a very relevant region with 3 out of the 7 reactors.
And would you say that the perceptions towards nuclear power are starting to shift? I think it was a demonstration at Almaraz. A lot of folks with their safety vests on out around the plant. That was encouraging. Do you think public attitudes are beginning to shift? It's certainly being echoed by the politicians there, but
yeah, definitely. So yes, we were at that demonstration. That was quite the atmosphere and quite the event. Almaraz, of course, being in a rural region of Spain, the plant I think employs like 3,000 people directly, and many thousands more indirectly. They are very, very well aware that the plant closing will be devastation for the area. Spain already struggles with the rural areas being depopulated, people moving into the cities, and so something like this would definitely be devastating for the region. And we're seeing it. We see it online. We see it on public polls. The public opinion is slowly moving in this direction to at least reconsider this. We used to say often that the power grid, kind of like the water grid, the roads, is something that you very much only think of, or health, right? You only very much think of it when you don't have it. The second you have it back, you stop thinking about it. And so this is a perfect example of this, right?
In terms of having a socialist government in office, I imagine that they have support from trades unions, the labor movement. Is there an element there where the trade unions might be putting pressure? That's certainly something that's happening in Ontario. We are in a sort of different phase where we're doing a lot of nuclear, not new build construction, but a lot of refurbishment work. So there's many tens of thousands of skilled tradespeople earning excellent wages at nuclear plants. Is there starting to break through at all, or are the arguments for nuclear mostly happening on the basis of economics or environmental reasons? What's the sort of change in the policy winds?
Yeah, definitely a big part of the success at the March of Almaraz, these 10,000 people were precisely the union or unions of in the plant, encouraging their workers to come out. So we also think this could be a very relevant factor. Of course, as you know, we're talking thousands of very qualified workers, in addition to the power plants bringing tons of income to the region in indirect income, property taxes, etc.
And so there was 10,000 people at this demonstration?
Yes.
That's got to be a world record for a nuclear.
Wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, I mean the whole region was there.
Wow.
But people from all parts of Spain, ourselves from Barcelona, people from Madrid, people from all the other power plants. So yes.
And have there been studies on what the economic impacts or the power price impacts would be of shutting down the Spanish nuclear fleet? Again, this is 20% of your generation.
That's right, 20% of the total yearly generation, generating at low cost, right? So the I'm blanking now. The levelized costs of existing nuclear very often can compete with a new renewable, and of course, in the I don't know about in other places. In the Spanish case, a very important part of the conversation is how these plants are taxed, right? So we're seeing that they can sell their power often at 65 euros per megawatt hour, but taking out the taxes, we're talking about 40, right? Now we would not, of course, it's probably not reasonable to expect the plants to pay zero taxes, but at least leveling it with other generation. We're talking in many cases tax duplication, which courts have already explicitly said is not within the rules. Regions applying their own regional taxes on top of national taxes. A big part, in fact, of I said before that the owners for the first time were kind of making noise against the phase out, right, publicly at least, and a big part of that was the hike in the waste management waste management tax. So the plants in Spain, as everywhere, I think they pay a fee that goes into a fund. That fund is to be used to dismantle the plant and take care of the waste, right? The plants, if you want to get a second into the weeds, Spain did have a plan for a centralized repository of its waste. It was to be built in Villar de Cañas, towards the center of Spain. That was approved by Parliament, but then through political pressures, national versus regional versus local administrations, it ended up killed. There were some foul play by environmental groups involved, and so now, after that was officially killed a few years ago, the updated waste management plan is the plants will, in addition to the interim storage that they will build an extra facility at every plant. So we're talking building the same thing 7 times instead of 1, essentially. When you put it together with the plants being prematurely phased out, which means that fund has less years to accrue interest, means the tax they have to pay went up like 2/3 in the last update of the waste management plan last year, right? So that got a lot of the owners to finally cry foul and to denounce that, of course, what the government is doing here is, tightening the screws on the taxes, forcing the plants to close because they're not economical, then turn around and say, see, we didn't make them, the owners closed them because nuclear cannot compete, implied with renewables, etc., right? So it's a whole other dimension as well.
That was part of Pedro Sanchez's comments, is these things were offline because they're just not economic. They're not competing against renewables. It seems like there's a bit of seasonality here. You mentioned you have these low demand parts of the year. Javier Blas had an interesting piece out in Bloomberg where he was processing some of the maybe lessons learned. And something he was saying is that, in these shoulder seasons when demand is quite low and there's a lot of generation, when the sun's coming out nicely in the early spring as it is now, there might be a need to curtail and throttle back solar in particular and wind at that time. That's not going to be great for renewables investors. I'm not sure what sort of mechanisms are in place in terms of guaranteed revenues. But the idea, I think, is going to be pretty hard to swallow for environmentalists that, hey, we have enough wind and solar to cover all of the demand today, but we're going to keep a bunch of fossil, because we need it for grid firming. And again, we talked a little bit about what that balance is and sort of learning lessons from this event. But talk a little bit about, I guess, the seasonality and I guess also where this plays into in terms of the importance of nuclear at maybe certain times of the year.
Right. So that's not a unique case in Spain, although it has some particularities that make it salient. But yeah, so of course you have what is clear from environmentalists, which is the confusing the goals with the means, right? Which is goal of generating with renewable energy instead of the goal being what we think should be, generating as much energy as you can, as affordably as you can, as clean as you can, and through whichever means you need to get there. And of course, the first order thinking of obviously all the renewable we have we should use, and then let other sources enter the market when that is affordable, can and will, and we have just seen lead to bigger problems in terms of only of increased emissions, but making the grid more fragile. How that can be mitigated? You've talked about capacity payments, either that, or basically curtailment to a greater extent. This is a problem that of course is also no unique to us. You've seen it in the U.S., right? As you said, liberalized markets suffering from this. It's definitely a complex issue.
And so I guess what I was trying to get at there in part was whether nuclear has a particular role at certain points that you mentioned. There's these shoulder seasons where it's offline, and this was kind of one of them. where they're refueling now because there's not a ton of demand. But I'm trying to imagine Spain without 20% of its power generation, which is, again, grid forming. What does that future look like if the phaseout goes ahead? Let's say we're in 2035 and all the plants are shut down.
Oh, it's quite simple. You burn more gas and you pay whatever the international market tells you to pay. Most of the gas in Spain comes by LNG, right, by ship. So that's a global market. That's a global spot market, as you know. And so we saw in 2022, right, there was a big spike, and that affected our prices. What the plan says, that's called the let me see the PNIEC, right, the National Integrated Plan for Energy and Climate. That's the name tells you a lot already there. You can see there that it's a completely work of science fiction, right? It makes sense only in a spreadsheet. So according to that document, we won't have any problem at all because all the bulk generation from the nuclear stations will be replaced by solar and wind and renewables, and a lot more batteries, a bit more pump storage. Of course, once you look at the numbers, as I said, pure science fiction. So we're talking about multiplying all the solar we ever installed times 7 between 2022 and 2030, a bit less for wind, and that is, of course, not counting all the units that you have to replace already. We see a multiplying of the interconnection with France to sell that power in excess and then buy back in other seasons. That's been stuck for the last, I think, 15 or 20 years. There's, people don't want the power lines in their land, etc., right? Again, these are not unique problems. What the plan says and what the reality will be if we shut down the nuclear plant is vastly different.
I guess one other thing that came up again in the reaction to this blackout was the idea there are parts of southern France that I think blacked out briefly. There was the interconnect that was ultimately cut off, and Iberia, Spain, and Portugal were islanded. But that there was this inertia, this spinning mass you mentioned, in abundance in France, and that we had 50 million people blacked out, confined to southern France and the Iberian Peninsula, but it could have spread through what I believe is the largest shared grid in the world. Talk a little bit about the role of France in potentially minimizing what could have been a far more disastrous blackout.
Yeah, exactly. So somewhat ironically, with this interconnection with the rest of the European grid, which in normal conditions should be stronger, should be a bigger percentage of generation to help smooth out these variations, probably was a good thing in this event because it limited. It's possible that it limited what could have been much bigger damage. The French grid said immediately, I think yesterday came out, that the inertia, spelling it out, that the inertia from their 65 or so nuclear reactors helped dampen that spike. Some towns in the south of France did go without power for just a bit, but yeah, of course, we can only imagine that if more countries adopted that approach, that incidents like this being much more wider scale in the future.
Guillem, if you have any final sort of thoughts, I think we're kind of wrapping up our time here, but any other reflections from the blackout, looking at energy policy in Spain going forward, or more broadly, any kind of last thoughts or reflections you have?
Well, it's just a reminder, right? I think it's a good way to close it is that we started with that. The electricity grid in this case, we only miss it when it's gone, and I'm sure you guys have found out the same. Talking about energy, getting people interested in abstract concepts like resource adequacy and grid stability. It's not something that causes an emotional connection to most people. Maybe some of us it does, right? Every publicist know that you need to create an emotional connection. I think you're not selling a new car, right? You're selling the freedom you felt as a teenager in the summer or something like that. When we say now resource adequacy, it's not an abstract concept. It means remembering when you were stuck in a train for 12 hours in a tunnel for some people. And so I think we have an important opportunity now, right, to make sure that this event is recognized for what it, again, developing story, could have been exacerbated with these decisions that put the grid at greater fragility.
I mean, just as an outsider, learning a little bit about the situation and this debate in Spain, it's just tragic again how in certain countries things have gotten to this point of being so polarized, where there's perhaps a lack of technical expertise in decision-making bodies, and just really poor decisions are being made. Obviously with the best of intentions. This always happens with the best of intentions, but just again how things are culturally coded, historically coded, politically coded. I really hope that you're able to reach a consensus in Spanish society in the way that they have in the U.S. or in the U.K. or in Canada, where there's a little bit more of a pan-partisan support for nuclear and for the services that it provides. So anyway, wishing you all the best there in Spain. I'm very glad that this event reversed itself so quickly, and really quite miraculous that the casualties seem to be in the single digits. Certainly. This was the best of all possible timing, it sounds like, for such an event.
Yeah, definitely. And yes, we will be working even harder in helping getting that across.
Okay, wonderful. Guillem, thanks again for making your first appearance on Decouple.
Yeah, anytime. Thank you, Chris.
Today's episode was made possible through a generous donation from the Xerxes Foundation and from listeners like you making pledges on our Substack. If you'd like to join the tribe, please do head over to our Substack, smash that pledge button, or if you would like a tax-deductible receipt, you can hit the donate button and make a contribution through our fiscal sponsor. We genuinely appreciate your support. It is only through your generosity that we are able to continue to offer energy literacy on demand.